Europe is burning up, is on fire. Literally and figuratively, we are experiencing a major heat wave in many parts of Europe, predominantly Central and Southern Europe. This has been going on for a couple of days now, and the news are filled with different perspectives on the power outages and the melting roads, the struggling infrastructures, trains catching on fire, cars catching on fire, humans dying, and the struggles of living in large cities like Paris and London during the heat when there is not much nature, there's not much place to cool down, and how people struggle in this situation. There's also some conversations how this might be the coldest summer we have going forward, that this is a thing that will occur and happen over and over again. And also the damages that we're going to have to deal with once this extreme pre-crisis situation is over. And today, that is what I'm going to talk about at the Multispecies Digest podcast. Hi, welcome. If you're new here, my name is Emilija, and I am a former researcher and an expert in multi-species approaches. You can also know them as regenerative, nature positive, socio-ecological. So in essence, I look at how humans and nature coexist, analyze situations of how, if there are any challenges, what are the different interconnections and interrelations, and most importantly, how do we go forward? What do we do in a world where we need nature, we need each other to survive, to continue living on this planet, and sadly we're facing a lot of crises, or at least this particular topic that I'm talking about today is a very in-your-face crisis that we're doing. But what I'm going to do today is try to analyze the situation through the multi-species lens, look at 4 different perspectives, 4 different angles, and then at the end also finish up with what do we go from here, how do we go forward. And before we start that, I want to talk about what is multi-species analysis. So what I'm trying to do here today is see, okay, we live in a world that isn't only filled with humans. Even though we are very commonly, or for many many centuries, in many professions, in a lot of research and education, things that we have learned, the cultures that we live in, especially in the Western world, we tend to focus on the human. So what do I as a human think, feel, do, want? How do I as a human interact with other humans? What are group dynamics? What is the impact of culture, policy, economic system, different infrastructure, products, objects, etc. on the humans? And then also, how do we as humans build a world around us that serves our purpose? So our desire to live, our desire to fulfill our needs, to stay alive, to be happy, to be joyful, to show off our social status, etc. So that's a very human-centered perspective. When we move into the multi-species thinking about the world, it's all about acknowledging that humans are not the only relevant beings, or humans and our creations are not the only relevant things on this planet. There's also animals, plants, different weather patterns, oceans, forests, beehives, complex colonies of things like, for example, fungi, and how they are creating a major underground network. And in general, also, how does the whole ecosystem function? So in multi-species approaches, we look at this interconnection between humans and nature. And I'll briefly talk about also the problematics of these terms, but I'll keep on using them today. So humans, human creations, how do they relate to nature? What is the mutual impact within that, and then also kind of what is the different impact across categories? So nature to human, nature to infrastructure, human to human maybe, and also nature to nature. And today we'll look at the 4 different angles of how we can analyze the ongoing heat wave. So this is the multi-species analysis. The main thing is, or the goals of multi-species analysis for me are usually twofold. The first one would be to start seeing the situations in the world that we live in as a multi-species happening, that there are things happening in this world, that there is nature, and that humans and nature are interconnected. So just seeing this interconnection is important, or learning the skill of analyzing human and nature interconnection. And the second one would be thinking, how do we change going forward? What do we need to do differently as humans, as society, as professionals, as businesses, as policymakers going forward? Because we are in a pretty dire situation with the state of the nature, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and we can see that it's already having a negative impact, large negative impact on humans on this planet. So the idea is, okay, what's next? And what do we do? How do we change so that we can adapt to this situation and hopefully also mitigate the damage and regenerate what we are doing? Another part that I want to briefly talk about is the what is human and what is nature. And why I want to do that is that these are, even though majority of us, majority of you, of the listeners, are likely, when you hear the words humans and nature, you're, oh, that's pretty definite, I know what it is. But actually, they are very complicated terms. There isn't a straightforward answer of what is human, a human, or human as an adjective like human creation. And also, what is nature? So is a tree nature? Is the microbiome in my body nature? Is my human physical body nature? And is my mind human? So there's a lot of contested perspectives of what these two terms actually mean. And there's a lot of research and also debate of that we should be stepping away from these terms, that these are unhelpful. And they continue to create this perspective of segregation, that we have humans on this planet and nature, that is something separate from humans, different from humans, that can exist without humans. And even though that's the idea of how this term came about, I do agree with that. It's quite a challenging topic, what nature could be. But at the same time, we are so used to as humans in the Western world thinking in this way. So I do retain in my work this idea of humans and nature. Why? Probably because it helps me to go around, but thinking of humans and also nature as complex entanglement of natural stakeholders. And here is a kind of a typology that I have developed in my work. So when I use the term nature, I mean a large complexity of things. These are organisms, so plants, mammals or animals, birds, reptiles, insects, the individual insect or bug that you see on the street, the dog in your home, maybe the tree in your backyard. It's the idea of these things that we are so used to seeing as individual organisms. They're also ecosystems, and often it's quite easy for many of us humans to think of ecosystems because being like, oh, but it's a lawn, it's a park, it's a forest, it's a river, it's a sea, it's an ocean. We have names and terms for these words. And then also we might be thinking of species, like, oh, the herrings, even though there are maybe millions or billions of individual herrings in the world, and there are also different types of herrings or different species of them, and also protected species. A lot of times it's easy for humans to think about, oh, the protected species. So in Latvia, where I come from, maybe beaver is a protected species, or a particular type of lily is a protected species. But you can also think about different species collectives like beehives and social insect colonies, also algae and fungi, where you can't really separate out a particular a particular piece of algae, or where does one algae start at the other end, or fungi, where does one strand, and what is a fungi if we know that it has a massive mycelium underground, and the fruit that we see, or like what we are used to calling mushrooms, is just this little bit on the top. We can also think about bacterial collectives, lichens, soil, life processes, or processes that sustain our life at a more physical and chemical level. That would be photosynthesis, decomposition of organic matter, nitrogen fixation, also different biogeochemical cycles like carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, etc. And then at the highest level, what we can also see is that we can think of weather and different patterns and processes of the atmosphere here also as nature, because it is a big part of nature. And I think this is where also today's topic of the heat wave plays in a lot. So this last category would be the process of the atmosphere, would be weather, or the immediate short-term weather conditions. Also season. In Finland, where I live right now, there is a definite difference between what is summer, spring, winter, and fall. But then we can also think of nature, or parts of nature, like the geological elements. It's a little bit tricky sometimes for people that I talk with to imagine bedrock, or just the rock laying there, as nature, or sand as nature, as a stakeholder that might have its own interests, and might be an actant in what we do. And then also the final aspect would be natural light. That, in my opinion, all of that is nature. Nature is very complex, and I know that many people will argue that, well, yeah, humans are part of nature. And yes, we are. But also, we as humans are so trained and so ingrained into thinking that humans are this special thing. We are human. We have this culture, and I am as this individual human. So that's why I'm retaining this also for the sake of the analysis, so we can arrive maybe at a nuanced understanding, or more nuanced understanding. But I don't have the words or the terms or the ways to, in this short period of time, describe you then what is humans and nature, and how can we reconceptualize it very differently. So let's then go into analysis of the heat wave through multi-species lens. And the first perspective that I have is the nature's impact on humans. So we analyze human and nature. Let's then look at what is the nature's impact on humans at the moment. So in the heat wave, I must admit, I am not located in Central Europe. I am up north. We have a comfortable 17 to 20, maybe 22 degrees here. So I don't have the visceral experience right now of living through this crisis situation. But from the news, the social media posts, Instagram reels, etc. that I see, and having sometimes been in the 40-degree heat, nature is having a massive impact right now. And by nature in this particular context, we're talking about the large weather patterns, the El Nino. So it was already predicted. El Nino comes around every if I remember correctly, 7 years. And it was predicted that this one would be super El Nino because of the impact of climate change. So this weather, sweltering heat, how the heat moves around in the atmosphere is having a massive impact on humans. So let's start with the human body. There is massive impact on the ability of the human body to function in a extreme heat. It can be linked to dehydration, heat stroke. Heat stroke can lead to organ failure, kind of changes on the protein structures of the cells of the body. So once you have a heat stroke, it might take a long time to really fix your body. It's not just, well, it came and went. It can cause massive damage to the body, especially those who are disabled, elderly, and children. So humans right now, as individual bodies, are undergoing a big crisis situation, regardless of whether that human is a politician, a social worker, a child, etc. Everyone, I assume, is in sort of a crisis situation, unless, of course, you have air conditioning at home. And sadly, most of Europe, or not sadly, but interestingly, most of Europe does not have air conditioning at home, and most European cities have not been built for this heat. So a lot of it is just figuring out, how do I as a human being survive this crisis situation? How do I cool down? How do I use the available infrastructure like air conditioners, frozen water bottles? I've seen people hide out in parking garages. In Switzerland, people are suggesting that people use the bomb shelters that are built in their apartment building blocks to go down and cool down. Supermarkets that have air conditioning are opening up their doors. But I think this moment in time really shows that nature does have an impact on humans, even though we are not used to seeing it that way. But this is a nature having an impact on us. I think the other side that we can look at is the nature's impact on infrastructure. And infrastructure in this case is kind of what humans have built. So it belongs to the human side of the multi-species analysis. But the image that you saw just a moment ago, there's some professionals and researchers have been looking at the infrastructure of London during this heat wave through thermal cameras, and it is visible that it can go up to 64 degrees Celsius. The railroads, the pavement, so the infrastructure is heating up. If we talk about infrastructure or like rail infrastructure, the railroads are bulging up because in heat, most of materials expand. And if they are taken to a heat level that they are not designed for, they expand and then also deform, because the spaces that are left to mitigate expansion from heat are not sufficient. So there are melting pavements, like asphalt literally melting off, plastic casing of light fixtures, or what they're called, traffic lights in Italy, melting down. So that is massive damage to public infrastructure that will take months, if not years, to fix. Also the damage to, for example, trains and cars that catch on fire because their engines are so heated up, power grids that overheat, the stations cannot function, and all of that can have cascading impacts on the humans. So if we just briefly talked about nature's impact on human as a body, then here nature has an impact on infrastructure, and then after that infrastructure has an impact on the human life and well-being and social systems and economic system, etc. But so infrastructure and what we have created is a massive part of multi-species analysis. And if we think of extreme weather events like this heat wave, then if we look through the multi-species lens, then we can see, well, yeah, we have designed infrastructure for a different climate, for a climate that does not exist anymore, or does not always exist. If these kinds of heat and weather events would be considered, let's say, once in 20 years, once in 50 years, then from now on, this might happen every year or every couple of years. So we have infrastructure that is not ready to hold the heat, that is not ready to manage it. Here in Finland, we had a heat wave a couple of years ago as well, and it was very clear that the way that our Nordic cities are designed are not at all to or they're designed to retain heat, not to prevent the heat from being accumulated. So we have also built a lot of our infrastructure in a way that excludes mitigation factors that could come from nature, for example, greenery. And there is a lot of research and studies on how urban trees, large urban trees, not the trees that we have just planted, but large urban trees, bushes, flower beds, water bodies, how much they decrease and mitigate the heat. Because if walls of the buildings, they accumulate, they suck up the heat, then greenery can reflect the heat and also provide shade that then kind of stops that cycle of things heating up. But the relationship between infrastructure and nature, and how nature will change and evolve, and in this case I am talking very much about weather patterns, about seasons, about water rotation, about floods, and extreme events that are going to be so commonplace that maybe they won't be perceived as extreme anymore. But when we do multi-species analysis, we can very much look into kind of infrastructure as the intermediary between the human and then nature, and what is the infrastructure, and then how do humans shape the infrastructure, and how we have done it for hundreds and thousands of years, and then how that infrastructure impacts nature, but then also the other way around. So we have nature, how does it impact the infrastructure that we have built, and then in turn then changes in infrastructure, damage in infrastructure, breakdown in the infrastructure, how does that feed into human lives? So it's kind of an indirect connection there. Then let's look at the other angle, and here is something that maybe not always comes to mind when we talk about multi-species analysis, but as I have already been saying, nature is not a monolith. So we can also analyze what is nature's impact on nature. And okay, what does that mean? The weather event is happening, it is nature, but the extreme heat event is not only damaging for the humans. If we think about the first things that might come to mind is our lovely cuddly pets that come to mind. Well, how do you cool down a pet? How does a dog survive 45-degree heat, prolonged heat? What are their physiological needs to do so? I don't know how much answers we have to those questions, or I would be interested to hear from maybe veterinaries and other sciences. Okay, how do we do that? But then there's also other animals, plants, birds, trees. The other category that we could think of are the enslaved animals, and we could argue that all animals that humans own are enslaved animals. But if we think about farm animals, the millions of cows, pigs that live in these areas, also chickens, turkeys, I don't know how much of salmon and fish farming is happening in these areas, but those animals are suffering. How do you, or I'm curious to what extent we know how does prolonged heat impact animals? How do their bodies react to this heat, and what can we do? So if just a moment ago I was talking about this humans, infrastructure, and nature, how there is a chain there, but we also need to think about, so what is the nature's impact on the nature that humans rely on? And then a third category we need to think of is the what we are used to calling the wildlife. So the wild animals, birds. There are photos of people in Paris giving water to birds when there was a heat wave here in Finland. There was a lot of talk. It was a 5-week heat wave back then. So a few weeks in, there was calls from the environmental agency to leave out water in places so that hedgehogs, squirrels, birds could drink. But so the nature, even though we would think, oh, this nature is now freaking out and damaging humans, it's actually the animals, insects, fungi that are gonna get damaged a lot as well. And I think it would be important for us to think, okay, if we as humanity rely on having nature, having this biodiverse nature, having the natural infrastructure, ecosystem services, whatever we want to call them, how do we take care of it in these extreme weather events? Because we might be more concerned with our own survival, and understandably so. Our own survival, the survival or functioning of our infrastructure, but then also what do we do with nature that is also dying, the trees that are getting burned up or dehydrated, the water bodies that are warming up, and there is either the fish and other organisms in it die because they cannot handle the heat, or then some parts of like a life, like there is now news that in France there is an outbreak, a large boom of flesh-eating bacteria in the waters. So how does nature and other species cope with that? I've no idea. To be honest, I have never looked into whether the flesh-eating bacteria that is dangerous for humans, whether it is also dangerous for other species. I might speculate both yes and no. I don't know, but it's definitely something to look into. So when we analyze an event from a multi-species perspective, we also need to think about that nature is not a monolith thing, and certain parts of nature can be dangerous and damaging to other parts of nature. We just need to think in these categories that I was talking about a brief moment ago. So if we think of the nature's impact on nature itself, then the final aspect for today that I want to talk about would be the human impact of nature. And right now on the screen, if you're just listening to the audio version, I have a man rolling a portable air conditioning unit, and these are very popular. The reels that I have seen from Germany, France, London, UK, Netherlands. There's a lot of kind of these funny reels of how people are rushing to the stores or trying to order the air conditioning units, or what people are using to cool down, like gluing emergency blankets to the windows to reflect the lights, also cooling down using a lot of frozen liquids, and just doing a lot to survive and mitigate this immediate crisis. And the part of the multi-species analysis is also then about looking into how do these mitigation activities further impact nature. So if we have humans using up a lot of the water, like taking a lot of showers and wearing wet towels, also using water to wash streets or whatever they else might be doing. And this is a hypothetical example. I don't have a clear city in mind where I'm like, oh, this is definitely happening. But let's refocus on the water. So if people are using a lot of water, or water at an increased rate of usage during this time, then they are taking that water from the water reserves. In Europe, a lot of the water reserves come from natural sources, come from nature. So Rivers, lakes, what is the thermal water or the spring water, etc. So the more that we use it up, the less there is for the rest of nature. And also during a heat period, then there is a lot more evaporation of water happening. So there's already less water available for nature, but then we are, as humans, to mitigate our own discomfort, we are kind of furthering the damage to the nature. The same with the air conditioning units or the infrastructure, the immediate objects that we use to cool down. They are built so the air conditioning unit has a lot of metals. That means that it is already a booming field of metal mining, and not only steel and ore, even though that is also a massive problem, but the mining of the precious metals. So I assume that the air conditioning unit, a lot of them have mini computers inside them, or a lot of them have kind of these electrical boards that use a lot of precious metals that are mixed together, that are extremely hard to recycle, and that take a lot of environmental damage in the process of where that ore is mined, to how then it is processed, packaged, where they're turned into elements for the electronics that we use to mitigate the heat wave, and then kind of resold and repackaged. So we can really analyze in these moments, okay, what happens, what do humans use, and then trace down what are the impacts on nature that we have during this heat wave, the things that we do to mitigate it. Also, if there's massive damage to infrastructure, like for example bulking railroads, the question is whether that steel and all those materials can be reused when the railroad is rebuilt. What do we do with all the infrastructure that is damaged? If there is plastics melting on the streets, then those plastics are most likely going to end up in the what are they called? The waste repositories. I think in Finland a lot of times that garbage is also burned, but then they're ending up in a landfill. So the damage, yes, the nature in this case has negative impact, damages the infrastructure, damages the humans. We as humans do something to mitigate immediately. We do something then also once this crisis situation, we do some mitigate the damage there, but then the negative impact of nature that we do while we mitigate this situation can then down the line, if we think of time, longer periods of time, can then exacerbate or make worse these already existing patterns. So it's kind of a closed loop that we are stuck in these situations. So if we kind of switch our gears, we have looked at the different angles, but what do we do going forward? Like, what's next? What is the situation? Where do we go from here? I think the first part is recognizing that this is a multi-species situation. This is a moment where we can really rethink of how humans and nature interrelate, how much humans actually depend on nature. We can also rethink our wrongful ideas about what extreme events we have, or the wrongful idea, well, climate change is coming. No, climate change already has arrived. It is here. This is what we're seeing, and there are going to be a lot more of these cases of damage caused by natural events, but also from other avenues, and degradation of lands, biodiversity loss, etc. So if we think of how do we go forward from here, I think the one moment that we need to recognize is that right now, people who are in this crisis situation, they are doing their best to survive and get by. And I mean that both or about the individuals, I mean that about the different businesses and organizations and infrastructure companies, and also policy makers and regulators who most often they have extreme event mitigation strategies, but so the people and the organizations and the policymakers who are in this extreme event right now, their main goal is to survive, mitigate the damage as best as they can to humans and infrastructure. I think we need to accept that. And for me, of course, as someone sitting in a plus 18 degrees Helsinki, it is a much easier thing to analyze from a distance. I am not in that survival mode. But once this crisis situation passes, I think it's important to learn the lessons in a multi-species way, in a way that recognizes and can do this analysis of human impact on nature, on nature's impact on humans or on infrastructure, and then also how do different elements of nature interplay with each other when these things happen. So kind of what we did just a moment ago. But if we think, if I go back to this kind of individual organization and policymakers, I'll start with individuals. I think this situation might be showing us that on the one hand, as individual beings, as everyday citizens, what we need to do is maybe spend a little bit of time thinking, what are the potential weather events that might happen in my life? How might I want to mitigate them? I'm not going to lie, I have been looking into buying some reflective blankets, even though I know they're plastic, but I know that if Finland starts heating up this year, the first thing that I have to do in my apartment on the sunny side is to tape over my windows. So what is your own individual strategy in this situation? And then also kind of learning these ways of thinking, okay, my relationship with nature, what is that? And then what infrastructure do I have? What can go wrong in certain environmental events happen? Then we as professionals, I think this is a good moment for us to think through, okay, how does my professional practice, how does it relate to heat? For example, I am a researcher. I use a computer to do my work and to, for example, record this podcast. Can this infrastructure function when it's plus 45? And that leaves out the question, can I function when it's plus 45 and do any work? But how does my professional practice depend on nature, on having a comfortable enough temperature to operate? How do my work tools depend on having, let's say, comfortable cool temperature to have my work space and place, my office, maybe my home working station, etc. But then also topic-wise, we can start thinking, and I'm not saying that every one of us needs to right away become a multi-species practitioner and want to save the world and save the nature, regenerate the nature in every aspect of our lives, but thinking like, okay, if nature starts deteriorating, and let's say I am a designer, what might that mean for my practice? Do I lose clients? Do I need to start doing work that will address and redesign the immediate issues? If I am a lawyer, how does law change? What does law say about extreme events or insurance and banking? If I am a banker, especially in investment banking, like, okay, how do all of my investments depend on nature being there? And there's quite a lot of resources already out there. If you look for nature positive or regenerative, multi-species, socio-ecological, even green and sustainable, you can learn a little bit or quite a lot about how to think about your professional practice from the lens of how does it depend on nature. Then, if you are an organization, and I would think or hope that organizations, of course, they're comprised of humans, but to start thinking what are the nature risks. And in this case, let's focus then on the extreme weather events. So heat, flooding, extreme snowfall, extreme winds and storms, hail, wildfire. There's many extreme weather events that we can talk about. In some areas it could be tsunami or earthquakes, which have also happened this week. But so as an organization, thinking through, okay, where do our nature risks come from? How can we prepare our processes? How can we prepare our people and our infrastructure so that when these things happen, it's not an utter disaster for us? So thinking through where are the different nature elements, and I'm not talking about the plants or the animals, but these obscure natural stakeholders like water, air, temperature, weather patterns, climate. How do those interlink with our operations, and how do we mitigate that? How do we prepare for that so that it's also, we can avert crisis situations, and then also the recovery might be less painful for the organization and also less damaging for nature. So if I would be an organization, that's what I would do. And then if for the policymakers, the politicians, the people who make decisions for the world at different levels, municipal, regional, national, and also international organizations that we have, I think it's similar. It's about analyzing the nature risks, and also building mitigation strategies that not only look at, okay, how do we preserve human life, how do we preserve our infrastructure, or how much infrastructure do we need to rebuild so that we have infrastructure that can actually withstand the weather patterns and the climate that is coming, so that we're not building infrastructure for a world that does not exist anymore. So yeah, we're mitigating impact on humans, we're mitigating impact on infrastructure, but also can we start thinking about mitigating the impact on nature in these weather events? What are the critical natural elements of your country or of your city? What needs to be protected? What are resources? Different animals, protected species. How do we deal with farm animals in extreme heat or during flooding? How do we mitigate so that we might preserve human life, but we also don't suck out all the water of the different spaces? So I think there is a lot of potential in, because currently laws, policy, regulation is a lot about maybe mitigating the damage on the nature, but it's not necessarily about like, oh, if we have a crisis situation or maybe a war, how do we protect the nature, the natural resources, the natural beings, the nature infrastructure in our country, so or our city or whatever. So that's, if I would be a policymaker, that's how I would think through these multi-species ideas for my constituents. So, and thinking of our constituents, if we're policymakers, not only as humans or companies, but also as the different natural beings and elements that we have there. So with that in mind, I'm gonna go enjoy the cool weather of Helsinki, even though I must admit I have a little bit of FOMO, and I have that FOMO oftentimes when something like this happens. Maybe I'm weird, but I think it's these are horrendous situations. It's very challenging to get through, but I think also if we want to shift to a world that is sustainable, that is regenerative, where we have functional, beautiful nature, where humans can continue living, these kind of extreme events can be great sources of analysis if we do it right, if we do it from the multi-species lens, if we really look at who, how, and where suffers, how do we mitigate that, and not only in humans but also in nature. So if you enjoyed this episode, please like, consider subscribing, share it with someone who might be interested in hearing that. And for now, I'll see you in the next episode.